Most of us are familiar with the prodigal story, the story of the prodigal son who takes off and comes home. At different times in my life, I have been all three characters in this story, and that's why it's so personal to me. I have been the older brother, I've been the younger brother, and I've been the father. So to keep with Andy's ability to set a very high standard on titling sermons, the title of this morning's sermon is Prodigal Schizophrenia. You know, I can connect with characters in shows and movies, and I can connect with the prodigal story. I'm a huge Seinfeld fan. I have all 9 seasons on DVD. My children have got them for me over a series of Christmases, and I connect with Jerry in the Seinfeld show. I just like to have fun. I'm always the guy with the quick answer and the joke, and we try to make people laugh. That's just who I am. But I also see myself in the other characters. And it's the same thing that happens with me in the prodigal story. So let's set up Luke 15 for just a second here. Jesus is in the home of a leading Pharisee having lunch. And he's trying to teach the Pharisees and scribes, and all the people who have been following Jesus start coming in to listen. And they are the tax collectors and the sinners. And the Pharisees and the scribes start getting upset, and they say, "Look at this guy. He eats and accepts in sinners." So Jesus responds with 3 stories. The first one is about a lost sheep. A man has 100 sheep. He loses one, and he leaves the 99 to go get the one and bring the one back, because the lost one is more important to him than the 99. Then he tells a story about a woman who has coins, and she loses one coin, and she goes back trying to find that one coin to bring that one coin back. And I can relate to that story. You can ask my wife Meredith. I am a master at dropping money. I don't know why. It falls out of my pocket. It doesn't matter what I have in the bank. I'm going back down Main Street in Franklin, trying to figure out where the $20 bill is that I dropped out of my pocket. But then it goes on, starting in verse 11 of Luke 15. He tells the story of the prodigal son. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father." Sorry, the iPad moved on me. "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am not worthy. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard the music and dancing. So he called at once to the servant and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So the father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. You have never given me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. I was born and raised as the older brother in that story. As a young child, I had a pretty strong spiritual resume. I'm going to be honest with you. My grandfather was the bishop of the Free Methodist Church, the highest elected position there is. My dad sat on the elders board. He was part of the stationing committee, so that every pastor, every year, 4 guys would get together and tell the pastors which churches they were going to lead the next year. My dad was on that committee. I was in the bell choir. I was in the children's choir. I was on the quiz team. I did home runs on the quiz team. And I was the only guy in the history of Westwood Heights Free Methodist Church to be the penny a day king 2 years in a row. When I got to high school, I continued on with exactly the same type of a spiritual resume. When we had the children's service, or the youth would lead the service, I was the guy they would ask to teach. I sang in the church choir. We had a larger denominational choir, and out of the denominational choir we had a small group, a meadow group called Sunshine, and I was in that. So I went out every Saturday and Sunday and sang. We sang the national anthem for the Detroit Pistons 4 times. So I was pretty special. I was a Kendall too, which that went a long way in the kingdom. When I got to college, I went to Grand Valley State in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so when we moved over there, we found a Free Methodist church, and I contacted them and started a college ministry. They would send out the church van every week, and I would load up all of my friends. We would go to church. I would often play the piano and sing during church, and then we went downstairs. We did a Sunday school class, and I was one of the leaders of the college Sunday school class. The problem with all of that in my life is there was no relationship that I had with Christ. It was just the lifestyle that I had been taught. That was how I was raised. I was judgmental. I was full of pride, if you couldn't tell. And I worked to impress God. When I sinned and I did something that wasn't right, I would personally make it right. When my girlfriend, fiance at that point in time, when my fiance got pregnant, I did the right thing. I married her. I became a stand-up guy. I got a job. I took care of my kids. It was okay because I fixed it. The religion that I had was absolutely out of habit and social networking, and it was just the framework of how I lived. And it was really out of selfish motives. It was comfortable. I knew it. As the older brother, I began to learn that it's not about the rules. And I'll tell you in a minute how I learned that it's not about the rules and how God broke me of being the older brother. But I've learned that you can't do anything to impress God. The work that you do in God's eyes is viewed as filthy rags. All that stuff that I did didn't impress God at all. So 15 years ago, I am working for a major corporation as a manager. Life is going pretty well. We're in our house. We got 3 beautiful daughters. But I wasn't I just didn't feel right. I wasn't excited about life. There was no excitement. It was routine. There was just no passion there. I was tired of being the older brother. I was tired of being the guy who always followed the rules. I was tired of being the guy who never went and sowed his wild oats, however you want to say it. So 15 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I had an affair with my wife's best friend. I moved out of the house, and we were filing for divorce. I did everything I could to ruin my family. And my wife had two choices. She could either behave as the older brother and throw the rule book at me and take me for, I was absolutely wrong. She could do anything she wanted and she was justified in doing it. Or she could behave like the father, who wanted to save the relationship and who wanted to restore and have reconciliation. Thankfully, my wife was the father and not the older brother. She never wanted a divorce. She did everything she could. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to hurt me. She wanted to restore the relationship. So Christmas Eve of 1997, Meredith called and she said, I want you to come home. I want you to spend the night in the extra room so tomorrow morning we can get up and we can have our last Christmas together as a family. And I agreed to do that, thinking I'll go home, we'll get it over with, and I'll eat dinner and leave. Well, I got up the next morning and we had a great time at Christmas. And Meredith is a good cook. She had a great ham dinner. And after we ate, we watched a little football and then maybe It's a Wonderful Life or something. I don't know what we did. But before I know it, it's like 9:30, 10 o'clock. And I didn't really feel like driving back to my apartment. So I said, is it okay if I just stay in the extra room again tonight? She said, yeah. So I spent the second night in the extra room. That went on for the next 5 days. Every day, I still had to go to work, but when I came back, I would say, hey, do you mind if I stop by? No, and I ended up spending the entire evening at the house and ended up spending the night. And she had given me the wedding rings that I had given her, and she said, these don't mean anything. I don't want them back until they mean something. So on December 31st, at the stroke of midnight of 1997, sorry, my wife accepted those wedding rings back. We are now in May, we'll celebrate 28 years. I like to tell people we've been happily married for 21, and we're celebrating 28. But she, she accepted me back. I moved back in. But it was interesting. We were living in Memphis. We moved to Nashville to kind of start our lives over. And God blessed us. I opened a flooring company, ended up doing full kitchen and bath remodels, becoming very successful. She started doing real estate, becoming very successful. But I realized that I quickly began to slip back into my older brother, just kind of a lifestyle thing. Well, in January 2002, we were getting ready to buy a 6,000 square foot house with a theater and a 3-car garage and all this stuff. And Meredith called me in January of 2002. She said, Rob, if this is the American dream, we've been lied to. She said, I want you to take a year off of work and figure out what God wants us to do with this family. Well, I really wasn't too upset with the American dream. It was everything I had hoped it would be. And so I said no, but I committed to talk about it. So we talked, and our talks became conversations, which turned into discussions, and then became arguments. And in frustration, in the middle of February, every husband, don't ever say this, I just put my fist down and I said, I am the leader of this family. I am the head of this household. I am not closing my business. And in defeat, she looked at me and she went, you're right. You are the leader of this family. Now lead us spiritually. So April 1st of 2002, I began a 1-year sabbatical. And it was amazing the things that I began to learn that year about God. I had always served God. I always thought I knew God, but that year I saw a God that I don't know that I had really ever seen before. And I learned about the glory of God, and I learned about a God who is so holy that when Moses stood in his presence, they had to put a veil over Moses' face because Moses' face literally glowed. I learned about a God who, like Andy talked about last week in 1 Kings 19, that his voice, his whisper, is more powerful than an earthquake or a tornado or a mighty wind. I learned about this God for the first time. I saw a God that I had never really understood. And it gave me this passion for God. And out of that year, we ended up starting Against the Grain to serve others, because I also saw God's heart to serve the poor. But we moved to Nashville. I went through that. And I still hadn't been the older brother in that, or the father in that story. And I don't know, if I had gone through that sabbatical, I don't know that I could have really been the father the way I should have been the father in that story. But our oldest daughter, when she was 18 years old, decided she had had enough of being a rule follower. She had had enough of following church as a religion. And she took off. She moved back to Michigan. She stayed for a couple months with my wife's mother, and then she left to go to college. And we went basically 2 years, almost 2 full years, without talking to our daughter at all. We heard stories, because we knew people in the town that she was in. We knew that she was partying. We knew she was being the prodigal son. The only contact that I had in 2 years was when I was able to get in touch with her through Meredith's mom to say, your dad's coming to pick up the car because you've been driving drunk. That's the only contact I had with her. And I think the interaction when I actually picked up the car was no more than 5 minutes. It was obvious I was not welcome in that situation. As the prodigal father, I guess I missed a point on the second one. As the prodigal son, I learned, let me go back to real quick here, that there is absolutely nothing you can do. There is no mistake that is big enough that you can make that God will not accept you back. I learned that life running from God is not nearly as good as life walking with God. As the prodigal father, during that time, I had to say the absolute hardest prayer I've ever said in my life. When Meredith and I got together and we prayed, God, you do whatever is necessary to bring our daughter back to you. As a parent, that's the hardest thing you can possibly do, because I'm telling you what, God can take your kids through some stuff. And that was the hardest prayer we ever had to do. And I know He took her through some stuff, and I don't know what it is. She still doesn't. She hasn't shared it with us. But as the father, while she was gone, I had to learn that God loved my child more than I did. That my daughter could be protected more by God than she could be protected by me. My initial instinct was, I'm going to run out and get my daughter and bring her back home. That wouldn't have worked. She was an adult. I had to let go, and I had to let her live the life that God had purposed for her to live. Now, the amazing part about her story, yeah, she came home. She has issues that she came home with. Today, my daughter, 27 years old, she actually attends here. 4.5-year-old, I have a granddaughter. She's 4.5 years old. Amanda is a single mom. But Amanda's heart has changed. Amanda's heart now is to open a home for single mothers who are struggling and going exactly through what she's gone through. She wants to now go serve the people that are living the life that she's living. She never could have done that if she hadn't gone through what she went through in her life. She was being raised to be just like me, the rule follower. The lessons about the prodigal father are really interesting. You know, obviously in that story, the prodigal father is God. But we all play the prodigal father as well. There are people who have offended us. There are people that have hurt us, and we need to keep the relationship. And that's the amazing part about this story is 100% about a relationship. In the beginning of the story, the prodigal son did not want a relationship with his father. All he wanted was his dad's stuff. And in the end of the story, the older son didn't care about the relationship with his father. All he cared about was with the stuff. And I really wonder when I read that story, it doesn't really tell us, but when I read that story, and the older son comes home and says, "Why are you throwing this party?" The father says, "Son, everything I have is yours." That's a legal statement. The younger son had already gotten his inheritance. So everything that in that house literally was going to belong to the older son. And I really wonder if the older son wasn't saying, "Why are you throwing this guy a party with my stuff? Because when you die, all that belongs to me. You're wasting the robe, the ring, the sandals, and the calf on a guy who doesn't deserve it." But the father cared more about the relationship. It wasn't a transactional deal with the father. It was about the relationships. Now, I don't know where you are in your life today. I tend to be all three people at the same time. My go-to behavior is to look at others and point out the sins that they have that are different than the sin that I have in my life. Yet at the same time, I want to be forgiven like the prodigal son. When I offend somebody, I want to be forgiven. But there are people who have offended me that I need to reach out to as a father. So I have this schizophrenic thing going on in me all the time on how do I respond with the relationships that I have. So as we get ready to take off today, I want you to think through this. First of all, I want you all to know the God that I know. I want you to know the God that is so holy. It's indescribable. And if you don't have that relationship, man, you need to get that right. Because it's about the relationship. It's not about the rules. It's not about showing up to church. It's not about being in the life group. It's not about giving your tithes. Sorry, Andy. It's about a relationship with Christ. So I want you to think about where you are in that relationship. But then, when you go home today, I want you to evaluate your relationships with other people. I want you to think about, how do you behave towards others? Are you the prodigal? Are you the brother? Or are you the father? How do you treat your wife or your husband? How do you treat your children and your neighbors? Do you view them with an attitude of reconciliation where the relationship is more important than obeying the rules or keeping a certain persona? How about when you're driving down the street and you see the homeless guy selling the newspaper? Or the single mom? Or the orphans in third world countries? Are we reaching out to them with the love of the Father and showing them the love of the Father? Or are we behaving as the older brother? And are we creating walls that are separating us from them, and more importantly, them from God? Because for many of the people that we work with, the only Jesus they will ever see is us. They're not going to walk into a church. They're not going to come seek a relationship with a pastor. They have no desire for that. We are the only representation of Christ they will ever see. So when you live today, let's begin to live like the Father in that story. Let's begin to reconcile relationships. Let's put down the offenses that have happened. And let's begin to build those bridges and reconcile those relationships.